Good evening. My name is Avshalom, or I would prefer Avshi Weinstein, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about our project, Violins of Hope. I'll tell you some stories about the pieces you'll hear, and of course about the violins that you're going to hear as well. So those of you who've already been to a Violins of Hope project, you are not allowed to answer. How many of you have been to a concert already? I know some of you here. Not enough, okay. So I'll tell you a little bit about the history of our project. It all started with my grandfather, by mistake, of course, like every other good project. My grandfather was born and raised in Vilna, and he fell in love with violin, but it took him a while until he actually started learning. He finished the conservatory on Vilna, on violin. He was a very good violinist. My grandmother was a very good pianist, and together they played in the silent movies. Everybody here knows, right? Some of the kids might look like, huh? But we know what silent movies are. But before immigrating to Israel, to Palestine in 1938, he realized that there are already great musicians over in Israel. Huberman established his orchestra. He took literally the best musicians from all over Europe, brought them to one orchestra, try to imagine, and he realized that maybe he won't be able to find work as a musician, so he learned a little bit of violin maintenance and repair, and after getting some money from picking up oranges and doing any other work he could, he opened our workshop in 1939. Now, my grandfather came from a small Jewish family, 11 brothers and sisters, but only one of his brothers survived. My grandmother had 7 or 8 brothers and sisters. None of her family survived. We don't know what happened to them because my grandparents never, ever talked about it. Now, in 1945 and later, survivors started coming to Israel, and they told about all the horror stories of the war. And from that time on, there was a very, very strong ban on everything German. No one wanted to touch anything made in Germany, including musical instruments. Many of them came to my grandfather, told him, unless you buy this instrument from me, I'll simply break it. My grandfather bought whatever he could, knowing that he can never sell them. So we ended up having a beautiful collection of great German-made instruments, which was basically worthless in Israel. Years later, my father had an apprentice coming from Dresden. We know Dresden was Eastern Germany. There was something like that then. And in Eastern Germany, like in many other parts of Soviet Union, they didn't talk too much about the Jewish Holocaust. Of course, they talked about the war, what happened and everything, but Jewish Holocaust wasn't one of the main things. When this person, his name is Daniel Schmidt, when he came to Israel in 1991, he met many survivors, he met some of the founding members of the Israeli Philharmonic, and he saw this beautiful collection that we had. It took him a few years to convince my father to give a lecture about those instruments and how they arrived to Israel. This was the first lecture of what today is Violins of Hope. After that, my father spoke on a radio show, and he asked people if by chance they have instruments with connection to the war, and they would like to give it to us for exhibits, concerts, lectures, and so on. And the next morning, around 9 o'clock, we got a phone call, a guy who had his uncle's violin. And we will talk about this violin a little bit later. It has many different stories. After that, we started doing concerts and lectures, and today we have over 100 instruments. We only have 8 here, but I have 57 here in LA that hopefully I'll be managed to send them back to Israel on Monday. So we are going to talk about a little bit about music in the war. The first piece that we are going to hear is the double Bach violin concerto. The reason we are going to hear it, because this is the only recording ever been done by a woman named Alma Rosé. Alma Rosé was a very famous violinist before the war. Her father was Arnold Rosé, the concertmeister of the Vienna Philharmonic for many years. Her uncle was the very famous composer, Gustav Mahler. And in those times, women were not allowed to play in orchestra in Europe. So Alma had her own women orchestra. They were touring all over Europe extremely successfully. But in 1938, her father was thrown away from the orchestra, even though he converted to be Christian with all his family years before the war. He took Alma with him. They moved to London. But Alma wanted to go back and play concerts. She didn't see herself as Jewish. She went back to the Netherlands. Unfortunately, she was caught by the Nazis, who sent her to Birkenau. Now, the Nazis knew who she was. When she arrived to Birkenau, she became the conductor of the women orchestra. And she was a typus, we will say in Israel. She was quite a personality. She believed that if the women will work hard and play well, the Nazis will keep them alive. So they had to practice all the time, learn new songs and new things all the time. But they stayed alive. 22 out of the 24 women from the orchestra stayed alive. Alma herself, unfortunately, did not survive. She died about 2 months before the liberation. But many of the women survived. I met few of the musicians from the orchestra. One of them is still alive. She was a cellist in the orchestra and survived. And the piece we are going to hear now is in the memory of Alma Rosé. So I would love to invite my wife, Seville, and Colleen Dicker for the first piece tonight, which will be played on 2 violins from the collection. This violin, many of you asked, is this a real Stradivari? The answer is, I wish. It would solve lots of financial problems for me. It's a very simple German copy. It belonged to a woman named Fanny Hecht. And Fanny, her husband and 2 kids left Germany a few years before the war. They moved to Holland. They thought they'll be safe there. Fanny had one of her neighbors, this woman, Wiesel, and Helen Wiesel, and together they used to play chamber music. When Fanny heard that they have to leave to be resettled, she gave the violin to Helen for safekeeping. She said, when I'll come back, I'll take it. She never did. Some years ago, one of Helen's Visser daughter-in-law, she saw a PBS documentary about us. They came to Israel from Calgary, gave us the violin, and went to Yad Vashem, the Memorial Holocaust Museum in Israel, and they found out that all the family, Fanny, her husband, and 2 kids were all killed. The second violin that we have for the double Bach belonged to a guy named Feival Wininger. Feival was born and raised in Romania, and when the Romanians joined the army, the Nazis in the war, they decided to expel tens of thousands of Jews to an area called Transnistria. Feival had to take all his family, took them 2.5 weeks to get there. His mother died on the way. When they arrived to the camp, if you can see, there is a small girl sitting in front of the drum here. This is his daughter, Helen. She was too weak to cry. They found a place to stay in the ghetto. Feival got a violin from one of his friends to play. It was a very expensive Amati violin. Today it would go for about $3 million. They played for the locals, and this is how they managed to get a little bit of extra food and survive. Until the Romanian police heard about this expensive violin, and they gave him 2 choices, violin or family. He had to give up his violin, and when one of the locals came to him and said, listen, my daughter, she heard you in one of the weddings. She really wants you to play in her wedding. What are the conditions? Feival said, you know, I don't have a violin, I can't play. So this is the violin that they bought. He found it in one of the small villages around the ghetto. And with that violin, he saved 15 family members. Now you see the very far picture on the right. This is the day Feival got his violin after we repaired it. He's 90 years old. Any of you seen a child smiling that big? No. When his daughter Helen brought us the violin the first time, she said, listen, my father, he's turning 90, he wants to play his violin, what shall I do? We took one look on the violin, we said, get him another one. Gonna be better, gonna be happier, win-win. So Helen went to her father, said, Dad, I'm gonna get you a better violin, a new violin, you'll be so happy. But he started crying. He said, no, I want to play my violin. Now, many of you probably know there are lots of survivors who never ever talked about what happened to them and their families. Feival did. Helen knew everything. She even wrote a book. She came back to our workshop, told us the whole story. Of course, we repaired the violin, and you can see what happened when he got it. So the double Bach violin concerto, enjoy. next piece that we are going to hear, it's two duets for violins by Dmitri Shostakovich. I know today the Russians are a little bit on the wrong side, but in those times, they're on the good side. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about my mother's side of the family. First row, you're not allowed to raise your hand. Anyone here saw a movie called Defiance with Daniel Craig, Liv Schreiber, and Jamie Bell? How many? Oh, not bad. I know you've seen it, Jeffrey. Come on. You remember what the movie is talking about? 4 brothers who lived in a place which today it's Belarus, then it was Eastern Poland. And when the Nazis invaded Russia in June 1941, rather to go and live in the ghettos, they decided they would live like partisans in the woods. They came from a small village in the woods somewhere. They knew the woods, they knew how to handle themselves, and this is what they did. But unlike many other partisan movements, they decided they will do one thing more than anything else, and is to try and save Jewish life. These were my grandfather and his brothers, and for 3 years, they fought the Nazis, they fought the anti-Semitism, and they saved as many Jewish people as they could. In July 1944, they were released by the Russians. There were 1,232 Jewish people walking out of the woods, including my grandmother and my grandfather. Now, those of you who have seen the movie, this is a spoiler time. You remember there was a wedding in the movie? Do you remember the scene? Now I'll tell you the true story. So when the movie was made, my mother went to Lithuania to see them filming it, and the director, Ed Zwick, told her, it's not a documentary, but about 150 million people worldwide will watch it. So it's not a documentary. And the real story is, my grandfather and my grandmother, both, again, small Jewish families, 11 and 12 brothers and sisters. They lived nearby. They knew each other before the war. I actually have some cousins here in the crowd from my mother's side. I have cousins who are both from my mother and my grandfather's side. So again, big family. And my grandfather was in love with my grandmother, but she was the youngest, and she didn't want to marry a village boy. She wanted something better. But the war started, and they made a deal. And the deal was, if he saves her and her parents, she will marry him. Now, he did. Unfortunately, when the war was over for them, he was drafted into the Russian army. My grandmother was pregnant when she heard that he died. Until today, we don't know what happened to him. I actually managed to talk to someone who served with him in the Russian army, but he didn't want to tell me what happened. So probably we will never know. My grandmother decided after the war that living in Soviet Russia is maybe a great thing for people, not for her. She took her parents. After a while, she managed to get to a DP camp in Western Germany. And after a while, I think about 1.5 years, she finally immigrated to Palestine, to Israel. You can see my grandfather and my grandmother. And this beautiful violin is dedicated to them. Asoel and Chaya Bielski. The Star of David here is originally inlaid. These instruments were made in an area called Schoenbach. It was the border between Germany and the Czech Republic. Very, very cheap instruments. These were done like that, almost factory made. They were very cheap. Many Jewish people played violin in Eastern Europe. Yud Lamed Peretz, one of the biggest, most famous Jewish authors, said, how do you know how many Jewish males you have in a Jewish family in Eastern Europe? You go in, you count how many violins you see on the wall, that's your answer. So this is the violin which is dedicated to them. The other violin that we are going to hear belonged to a person named Max Becker, another family tied to my father's side. You can see Max here playing on his violin, sitting in the orchestra. Max was a Polish soldier, so about 3 weeks into the war, he became a POW. In those times, the Nazis did not separate Jewish and non-Jewish POWs. And when he was working in one of the labor camps, his friends realized he is a violinist, so they bought him this violin, and he played it. Now you see the guy standing? This guy, his name is Wolf Domarshkin. He's coming from a very known family of musicians from Vilna. And those of you who knew my father knew that he loves collecting. Almost everything you can imagine. And one of the times in the flea market in Tel Aviv, he found a program of Jewish composers, Yoel Engel. They made a concert in 1936 in Vilna. Wolf Domarshkin was conducting, and my grandfather played viola. Max survived. Wolf Domarshkin unfortunately died about 3 weeks before the liberation. Max Becker survived. He married the sister of Wolf Domarshkin later, and he was playing in one of the DP camps in Germany. And when Leonard Bernstein came after the war to tour in Europe, he insisted on playing concerts with that orchestra. So we are going to hear a little bit of Shostakovich on these two violins. The next piece is going to be a surprise to Joel in few ways, but we will leave that for now. This very beautiful lady that you're going to see here, her name was Violette Silvestain. And when she was growing up in France, her mother said, "Daughter, you should learn how to play violin. You never know, it might come handy one day." When she was sent to Auschwitz-Birkenau, she tried to do an audition to the women orchestra. The conductor, then a Russian lady, didn't accept her. After a while, like I said, Alma Rosé arrived to the orchestra. She took over. Violette tried again. And this time, Alma told her, she said, "Listen, you're not a very good violinist," which was true, but we'll give it a try. The piece that you're going to hear, the Tais, Meditation by Massenet, this was the piece that she did the audition to the orchestra. The audition that basically saved her life. She played with the orchestra, and you can see her here in the middle. They had a reunion, and the lady, not in the middle of the table, the one to the right, her name is Anita Lasker-Valfi. She is the last survivor from the women orchestra, still alive. And the photo on the right is the day we got the violin. You see her son and daughter who brought us the violin. Now, Violette never played on this violin since 1940, when she was sent to the camps. It had 1940 bridge, 1940 strings. Later on, when we opened the violin to restore it, there were 1940 woodworms inside. But still, we decided, let's give it a try. This was about an hour before a concert in Paris. We said, let's see if we can tune it, maybe play a few notes. We managed to tune it. My wife, Seville, played few notes from the music you're about to hear for the first time on this violin since 1940. Later on, my father made a huge restoration, and the violin is in our collection. Her son, Olivier, he told us that one day his mother, she was already very sick. The orchestras in the camps had to play in the morning for the inmates to go out to work, and in the evening when they had to come back. And he said his mother was so sick she couldn't keep up with the orchestra. The Nazi officer came with his gun out to shoot her on the spot, and Alma came running back. She said, "You can't kill her. She is my best violinist," which was, of course, a lie. But a lie that saved her life. So the Meditation Tais by Massenet in honor of Violette Silvestain.
Good evening, everyone. We are very, very honored to be here with you tonight. And we are so lucky as well that Colleen has super talents playing so many instruments. And just to make it a bit more heard, we would love to perform Master Meditation for violin and piano. And later on, we will continue a cycle where you can also join us if you would like to sing. And don't worry about applauses. We are here just to meet with the instruments and to unite. We are not bothered if you applause on the wrong time or if you continue playing. Welcome again.
We are not done yet. So, a few questions. How many of you recognize the first song? We are not done yet. You can sit down. Don't worry. We still have more. How many of you recognize the first song? Not bad. The reason we played that was about a year and a half ago. We did a project in Florida, and the woman who organized the project said, I really love this song. I said, okay, I love this song too. I think it's one of the, if not the best song ever written in Hebrew, very, very close to that. And then she told me a story. Everybody knows Elie Wiesel, right? She said that Elie Wiesel came to the second March of the Living. He was supposed to be the keynote speaker, and just before him, there was a singer who sang this song, Elie, Elie. She said he went on stage. He said, after a song like that, I can't talk. And he didn't. Now, I have a question for you, Janet. Is the rabbi crying already? Good. Avinu Malkeinu, everybody knows. I don't think there is a reason why not to do it, right? So these were 3 songs. The next song, Colleen is going to talk about it, and I'll tell you about the violins.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Colleen, and I'm the current musician in residence at B'nai Vail. And I'm so grateful to Rabbi Joel Newman for connecting me with these incredible humans and these beautiful instruments. Thank you so much. So I have had the honor of working with this incredibly talented woman and building this program with both of these beautiful people. And when we were talking about what music we were going to play, they told me that I could pick a piece, pick an American piece that you love. And in my head, I'm thinking, you're asking a Kansas City fiddler to pick something to play on the lost voices of the Holocaust? Oof. So I thought of many, many things, and there are so many things I love to play. There is a piece, it's called the Appalachian Waltz by an American composer, Mark O'Connor. And I recently celebrated my bat mitzvah in Georgia in the Appalachian Mountains. Thank you. Yay. And it was a deeply spiritual experience for me. And if any of you guys have been there, there's a similar thing here in these mountains around us. It's just so majestic. It is awe-inspiring, yet so calming. And I thought, what energy do I want to bring to these fiddles that have seen so much and been through so much? And I just wanted to channel the deepest peace that I could think of, and I thought this piece was perfect. So please enjoy the Appalachian Waltz.
So, the next 2 violins that we are going to hear, this is a violin. It's very unique. You can see the very small Star of David inlaid on the back, and the owner playing on this violin before the war. This was made by a Jewish violin maker named Yaakov Zimmerman in Warsaw in 1924, and the label inside, he dedicated it to his friend that we see here, Shimon Korngold. Unfortunately, Shimon, who was a wealthy industrialist, when the war started, he ran away, but he died in Tashkent. And in 1947, one of his best friends brought the violin to the Korngold family in Jerusalem. Now, you remember when I started talking a long time ago, I told you that after my father spoke in a radio show, the next day we got a phone call. That was the nephew of Shimon Korngold who gave us his uncle's violin. Now, my grandfather, before immigrating to Israel, learned violin maintenance and repair with Yaakov Zimmerman. Now, you know, Jewish people, it's kind of a small sect around the world. And one of the best Jewish musicians in the 1940s, 50s, his name was Michel Schwalbe. Michel Schwalbe later on became the first concertmeister of the Berlin Philharmonic. And he grew up in Warsaw. And he told my father that he remembered going to Yaakov Zimmerman as a child, getting all his instruments repaired and given to him free. And his violin lessons were done at Shimon Korngold's house. Because he was coming from such a poor family, his parents didn't want to bring the violin teacher home. So both of them helped Michel Schwalbe, who became the first concertmeister of what was and still is probably the best orchestra in the world. And even Karajan, who was a very enthusiastic neo-Nazi. All the big recordings he made were when Michel Schwalbe was leading the orchestra. Now, one small question about Elie Wiesel. Let's see who knows. Does anyone here know that Elie Wiesel played violin? Not bad. Usually it's nobody. So one of my mother's best friend, Yoel Rappel, was a secretary of Elie Wiesel for some years. And Elie Wiesel told him that when he was young, he learned violin. So he would go to the lesson, he had a bottle of a drink, put it on the table, not for him, for the teacher, of course. And the lesson would go on as long as there was something to drink. Bottle finished, lesson finished. Unfortunately, he never kept playing violin, but he did study. And of course, he survived the war. We all know his books and his passion about telling the stories. The second violin that we are going to hear belonged to a person named Heinrich Haftel. Heinrich Haftel was a German Jewish musician, a student of Huberman. And you remember I told you that Huberman, when he established the orchestra, wrong violin. Haftel? No, you have the right violin, wrong picture. So Huberman, when he established his orchestra, bringing so many great Jewish musicians, he needed someone to make sure they are in control. He chose his student, Heinrich Haftel, to be one of the very first concertmeisters of the orchestra, and this is his violin. So the Appalachian song. making a concert like that, it's almost like taking two kids to a candy shop, which they can try, taste, give back, and decide which one they want to eat when. So both of them, of course, wanted to play all the violins, all the time, but we had to make some choices. So for the very last piece, we chose these two violins. This very nice French violin belonged to a person named Gérard Lanier. Gérard was a French police officer. He wasn't Jewish, but he helped Jews to try and escape Europe during the Nazi occupation. They took people to their houses. Some of them, it was for them a place that they stayed few nights, some longer. Few times people told him, they said, listen, we can't stay in such a small apartment. Can we please take a walk? So he would take them down. They would walk, and if someone would say, what are you walking with two Jews? He said, well, I'm a police officer. I'm taking them to the Gestapo around the corner. Of course, turning around, running home, hiding them again. He was recognized by Yad Vashem as a righteous among the nations. And a few years ago, his son, Gérard, when he heard about our project, he came to our workshop and he gave us the violin. Now you see on the left here, there is a book, You can't see how thick it is. It's about this thick, with lots and lots, thousands of photos of Jewish people from France. When Gerard came to our workshop, he opened the book on this page and started crying. It's not easy to do this work. I'm sure it's much more difficult to actually play, so I'm very happy I don't have to. And this photo of these 3 kids, he said, they were in their house for a few days. Nobody knows what happened to them. He remembered hosting them in their house for a few days before they left to the next person who was dealing with them. But unfortunately, we will never know what happened to them. Now, Colleen fell in love with the Bielski violin, and she said, I really have to play on it. So for this very last piece, the partisan song, we had to have the Bielski again, of course. And let me tell you another piece of real history, unlike the movie. So those of you who remember the movie, the last scene is when there was a very big attack on the forest, and they had to run away. So these attacks happened all the time. My grandfather and his brothers, they were the most wanted people in the area. First of all, they were Jewish. Second of all, they were partisans and killing Germans. You can't get worse than that. So in one of those attacks, the whole forest was surrounded. They had no idea where to go until someone came to my grandfather and his brother said, listen, I know these woods. If we go to this and that direction, we'll reach a swamp. But in the middle of the swamp, there is an island. So in the movie, after 10 minutes, they're out of the swamp, very big gunfight with their Nazis, they win, everything is fine. Never happened. It took them 3 days to cross the swamp. And my grandmother said that at night they tied themselves to the trees with ropes and belts so they wouldn't drown. They reached the island. They had no food, but literally no food. They ate roots and leaves for 2 weeks, hearing the Nazis all the time, but the Nazis never went into the swamp. 2 weeks later, when the forest was cleared, they went out of the swamp, found a bigger place to stay, and this is how they survived. So for the last piece of tonight, we have the partisan song. I really, really hope you enjoyed, learned something, and hopefully we'll see you Friday. Thank you very much. It's done. Thank you very much.